I think of it as being something in which Paul was a major architect, and I talked with him about that, and I have to tell you that the way in which he described it is something that I found to be just the essence of what I think good lawyers in this field think about and do.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about, you talked a bit about water rights, and we couldn't go without talking a little bit about the water rights framework today. And you talked eloquently about the need for creativity and problem solving, and it's one of the things you admired Anne for the most, and you've given some great examples. But what is the most encouraging thing that you've seen happen in the vein of getting to solutions over the past decade?
Well, I touched on some of the things that are happening regionally and sub-regionally and that sort of thing, but the singular achievement in that regard, for me, is Sigma. Because groundwater management in California has been such a terribly challenging thing for so long. And the degree of, I'm going to use the word not in a pejorative way, but the degree of resistance to any form of regulation or control has been fairly substantial. And of course, in recent years, this most recent drought in particular, the amount of groundwater pumping that we have seen in various parts of the state has just mushroomed, and we're seeing all the evidence of groundwater subsidence and aquifer difficulties and that sort of thing. All of those things are kind of like chickens coming home to roost for me in a state where we have turned away from the idea of looking at managing our groundwater in a more comprehensive way. The brilliant stroke of Sigma, for me, is that it's not going to be something that's going to be dictated from Washington or from Sacramento. What it does is cause the locals, the individuals, the entities that overlie a particular aquifer to talk, and to talk between themselves and among themselves about what the facts are and what their various interests are, and to look at what they're doing, to do monitoring and start to talk among themselves about trying to figure out how their resource is going to be made sustainable. I see great promise in that. And I certainly am not an expert in Sigma. There are a lot of people in this room who are out there working in that field every day, and they may have different views. But some of the anecdotes that have come to me cause me to be optimistic about the fact that over time, it's just getting started, it's going to become very significant. And that encourages me perhaps more than any single other development.
That's great. So the framework of Sigma encourages people to have to talk together locally. Do you think there's anything about the framework of our water rights laws that mitigate against that, or is it really just the choices that we as individual participants make?
I think it's a little of each. We do still live in a water rights fundamental state. I mean, water rights are water rights, and I can think of half a dozen examples in which, when dealing with stream systems where there are water rights of varying ages and degrees of security and that sort of thing, where it's really hard to get people to talk to each other. Every once in a while something happens that might force people to talk to each other. A drought can be a good example of that. Frankly, when your board starts looking at things like a water quality control plan for the Delta, or starts looking at water rights curtailment issues for streams where there just isn't enough water to go around, some of the things that are happening because there's an 800-pound gorilla in Sacramento is watching, some of those things actually either force people or encourage people to talk to each other in ways that they might not have done without that degree of encouragement or incentive. I think that's positive, and my hope is that people won't lapse back to the point where they're all gonna run back to their water rights and say, well, I can divert in 11 months, and you can only divert in 2, and, you know. I'm hoping that those lines of communications that have been opened are going to continue. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, and I don't know if you're going to get to this. And if you are, I'm sorry for stepping on your line.
Hey, it's your day.
And this goes back again to my East Bay Mud experience. When I talked about the 20 years of balancing in that litigation and how we went up and down a bunch of appellate court ladders for a long time, and then we went back to the trial court, and the trial court sent us to your board, and we were there for 3 years. We tried the case twice before the water board. Once to the staff, and that resulted in a report that was about that big. And then we tried it again to the board, we weren't there then. We tried it to the board, and they wrote a separate report, and it was about that big. And then we went back to the trial court. And on the first day, the judge who had sent us up there in the first place said, I'm going to retire. And so the presiding judge sent us out to another judge. And we walked into his court. And he said, I hear I'm getting a water case. He said, I had a water case once. And then he proceeded to regale us with a story about how he'd had to handle a case where there was an uphill owner of a house in Oakland, and the neighbor downstream, and they had an argument about the routing of the downspouts. And he was very proud of the way that all worked out. And our lawyer, he was reading water from the scribbler, stood up, and he smiled, and he said, thank you, Your Honor. This is going to be a little different. Well, we ended up before the board and before the court, in part because of the doctrine of concurrent jurisdiction. And although this is not a direct relationship, if you want to learn about concurrent jurisdiction, one of the places you go is to the Audubon decision, because there the court said that in regard to issues under the public trust doctrine, the courts and the board do have concurrent jurisdiction. And if you read the opinion, Justice Broussard, who wrote it, said that was a close call. I think there are a lot of instances in which we might be better off if we didn't have concurrent jurisdiction. I've never pursued that because each time I started to go down that avenue and talking to people wanted to talk about water courts, and I wasn't ready to go there. But you know, I think concurrent jurisdiction, at least in our experience in that case back in the 80s, was a hindrance to getting to where we needed to go as fast as might have otherwise.
Just because there was so many process options.
Exactly.
Well, I have a few more questions.
Sure.
I'm going to reserve the right to ask the last question, but I want to be able to turn to the audience, being mindful of the time. Questions in the audience?
My gosh, I put them all to sleep. Rita has a question.
Bob, you mentioned, Bob, the human right to water, and as we've seen, you know, in the Central Valley, some of these communities have really suffered, and we're finding out more and seeing more than I ever thought there was. Put on your prophet hat and see, is that leading to the new public trust? Is it leading to water, a free slug of water for folks, or lifeline rates, or what do you think?
That's a really tough one, Rita, and I hope everyone was able to hear her. I don't know exactly where it will lead. We don't know exactly what the statute means yet, because nobody that I know of, I'm not aware of any cases in which it has been interpreted. The question of the human right to water in some respects has been raised by the terrible experiences in Flint, Michigan.
Right.
And there are, in some people's mind, little Flints in various places in California. And we've seen areas in which, you know, groundwater resources have disappeared for shallow domestic wells, or you know, that kind of thing. I don't know precisely where the right to water will evolve. I think we will gradually see, and this may be one of the directions that the Division of Drinking Water, which is now part of the Water Resources Board, may take us, and that is the whole idea of consolidation of water systems in order to avoid the tiny little systems that seem to be more prone to get into difficulties. I don't know that that's necessarily the answer. I don't think the state's going to go around forcing mergers, but I think that that kind of direction is important. I don't know whether we can expect to see governmental programs that are going to dictate things in that regard. And unfortunately, what that can mean is that there are some communities, some individuals who are going to always be kind of behind the power curve. I don't have an answer for that. I thought that the legislature did a good thing in adopting that statute. I'm not 100% sure that I know exactly what the legislature viewed as it leading to, and I wish I had a better answer for you. I think it's important for water entities everywhere to have in mind the fact that there are some individuals and some communities that for which access to clean, good quality, affordable water is a very difficult problem. And I think the water utilities of the state need to be aware of that, while at the same time having to cope with all the other things they have to cope with, like adopting rates strictly based on Proposition 218 and that elusive idea of the actual costs being driving every single piece of your rates. It's not an easy job, but we do have the less fortunate to be concerned about.
No, that's right. There is actually a lot going on. I'll tell you, for example, East Porterville being hooked up now through a host of great folks trying to do something about it, and there have been some consolidations. And there are actually, and this will make your heart glad, there are all kinds of conversations happening in the agricultural community as well as in Aqua about really trying to rise to the occasion and figure out how to deal with the very complex stuff. And the $500 million that was in the bond has been quite helpful as well. There's more to go.
See, Rita, I shouldn't have spoken first. She knows much more than me.
No, thank you both, thank you both.
Yep. Michael.
Yeah, I was really taken by this obligation to prevent waste. And I was thinking, because there's so much emphasis in water law in California about, oh, if that goes to litigation, there's no obligation to do anything for generations. And I was wondering if, in the face of climate change and other changing circumstances, whether this obligation to prevent waste of a trust resource might actually lead to, say, common sense instead of extreme litigation.
Common sense on building more reservoirs?
No, absolutely not. But, no, actual instigation to experiment with an action rather than arguing in court and then assuring the public that it's being taken care of.
Well, I think most of the lawyers in this room would agree with me that probably the worst way to resolve a competitive conflict-laden situation involving competing claims to a finite resource is to go to court. I believe that the process takes over at that point instead of the resolution of the problem. And I hate to keep going back to the same old well, but 20 years of arguing about balancing in the East Bay mud case, and 10 years later, some people from the two entities got together and said, let's just talk. And they found a way to solve the problem in a way that benefited both of them, that made better, more sensible use of an available resource. And I think that idea, the coming together, the partnerships, the communities communicating with one another, I think that extends to avoidance of waste, and I think the context to which you were, in which you were using.
Do you think that it would have been possible earlier in those 22 years, even 2 years in, if two people in those roles from the warring parties, who weren't the lawyers, but were the principals, you think they could have sat down 2 years into it, or did it have to go 10 or 22 years before it could evolve, or did time just evolve in terms of people's sensibilities?
Well, the evolution of time was a big part of it. The battle was joined on several fronts. If it were just two parts, if it were just Sacramento County and East Bay Mud, it might have been more likely that those conversations might have happened earlier. But there was a whole host of other issues that were being brought forward by other litigants. And so, taking that first step was a challenging one.
After 22 years, no one could argue with it?
After the 20 years of fighting, as I said, both sides were able to claim a victory. East Bay Mud could say, well, our right to divert was recognized. And those who were trying to protect the recreational in-stream fisheries, et cetera, interests of the lower American River could say, and our interests were recognized. Okay, so now the two entities that wanted consumptive use of the resource, recognizing that all those protective measures for the lower American were in place, they could talk. So in some respects, you had to clear out those other issues, those other litigants. And I don't mean to be critical of anybody in saying it when I say it that way. But what it came down to was the two entities that each had the consumptive water use needs. That's why they built the two sets of gates in the canal before the fight ever started. They sat down and said, let's talk. And the result was a successful project.
Impressive.
A good model project.
Spark was next. There we go. So we have this little, is there anybody back there that I'm completely ignoring because I can't see you? Okay, we're just gonna stay right here.
I'm going to agree that Sigma gives me great reason for optimism, and I hope to live to 2040 when all these groundwater basins become sustainable. But in case I don't, could the legislature, or should the legislature, just turn around and say 2040, we meant 2025, or we meant 2030?
He wants me to talk about what the legislature means. I think that's a Felicia question. No, seriously, I don't know. I think these issues are going to take some time. In some of the communities, it's going to be harder to get the conversations started than in others. And so I suspect that it is going to be a gradual process that will be at different rates in different communities, and it may be 10 years out or something, that the legislature might look at it again and say, going awfully slowly in some places and try and find some way to give a more added incentive. But I kind of think it needs to take its course. So I am not as concerned about the, let me call it the upward glide path as I think you are. I'm optimistic. And I think Mary Eileen had her hand.
Yes, Mary Ann.
Mine is sort of
Your
an
board member
esoteric
goes first.
question. You brought up Flint, Michigan, and how do you view Flint as a, is it just a unique situation, and has it detrimentally affected the way the public looks at water?
Well, those are good questions, Mary Eileen. Flint is a big glaring example of a problem that I think exists in other places in the country and in the state, and hopefully it will help us shine a spotlight on some of those other circumstances. Flint was an example of I guess I can only say it this way, governmental failure at every level. That's the way I view it. I have my own favorites as to where most of the blame lies. I'm not going to do that. But things could have been handled a lot better from the get-go. But once the problem arose, government was slow to respond, and that's unfortunate. And so people are still drinking bottled water there, and it's likely to go on, as I understand it, for another 2 years. And in much of the community. I hope that throughout the country and throughout California, that there are people, entities in communities where those kinds of problems exist, who are going to take heed of Flint and who are going to say, we're not going to let that happen here. And that's maybe going to cause the need for some investment that might not have otherwise happened. And there may need to be some regulatory impetus put behind the making of those investments to protect the people who are receiving less than optimum water. But I think we need to keep Flint in our mind because it was a horror case, and we can learn from those.
Going back to Sigma, just to complicate things a little bit, to a lot of people, you have a choice of either getting surface water or groundwater. And a lot of the surface water projects, the bigger ones, were set up in part to relieve the pressure on groundwater. And people relied on that and created either populations or agriculture, permanent agriculture that
Yes.
relies on that. So don't we need to pull all of that in together in solving Sigma, the reliability of these surface delivery, not every year, but how it all integrates in with groundwater? It appears to be a key thing that seems to not be given enough impetus in how you solve groundwater problems.
You know, Pierre, one of the things that I have thought about a lot with regard to sort of the big picture of issues that people in this room have been dealing with for many, many years is that we do best when instead of digging our foxhole a little deeper and hunkering down inside it, we get our head up above the top row of sandbags on our foxhole and we look around. To me, part of the promise of Sigma is that the same people in the communities in overdrafted groundwater basins who are now going to find themselves, hopefully, talking and attempting to focus on what the real facts are and understand one another's interests and try and find common ground. Those are the same people who, in those communities, probably know the most about surface water and probably know the most about integrating surface water and groundwater in that particular community, in that particular basin. I think that, you know, we've got so much surface water law and so much surface water policy and so many decisions that have been made and all that. Groundwater has just been different, and it's been sort of the missing link in terms of looking at California water resources on the whole, in a holistic way. And I'm hoping that Sigma will help us get there. I don't know that it's going to be even as fast as 2040, the date that Sprague referred to, but I am optimistic that some of that's going to happen. And, you know, Orange County areas that you and Mary Eileen come from, in many respects, have sort of provided some models for the way that integration, surface water, groundwater, recycled water, indirect potable reuse, all those things have to fit together for us. I mean, what are we now, 38 million people, and what are we going to be in a few years? It's at least 50 that year. So, I think your point's well taken through that integration is absolutely critical, hard to come by without learning.
There's a question over here.
And do you think Sigma will also, there's a lot of contaminated groundwater, a lot of groundwater is unusable, particularly in urban areas due to contamination. Is Sigma gonna spur to find creative solutions to resolve those issues between regional boards, PRPs, and local water utilities?
In an ideal world, yes. Is it going to be easy? No. But it seems to me that in any particular groundwater basin, a a contaminated basin or contaminated portion of the basin is a huge issue that those people who are doing that conversation about ending up at the end of the day with a sustainable groundwater resource that's going to have to fit into that picture. Does it automatically get solved just because you're starting that conversation and forming the agency and that sort of thing? No, it's going to take a lot of really hard work. All of this is really hard work.
Others, before I go back to my question? Hard to see, so you have to wave your hand frantically. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, since you're on a roll, could you
Oh.
talk about the relationship between water and food? Because we have the human right to water now. It seems a little like a silo when you can't grow food, and we as human beings use food as energy, and there's a water energy nexus. And is California yet talking about a water food nexus? And why does our law only represent the human right to water, and why are we separating that out?
I can't speak to why the law was written in the way that it was written, but I can say this. Talk to a farmer. Talk to an agricultural water community. Talk to a business that is dependent upon there being an available supply of water to grow the crops that are going to become the food supply for the community or for the state or for the nation or for the world, given what California is. I think there's a very close relationship. It may not be identified in quite the same way that you are addressing it, but it does seem to me that inevitably and inexorably the California water picture, however it evolves, is going to have to include a great deal of attention to making sure that we have adequate water supplies in the right places to grow food, because we have some of, maybe the best, agricultural growing conditions anywhere in the world. And we have demonstrated that we can do it on a big scale. And it's a big and growing state and a big and growing world. So I don't think that's a perfect answer to your question, as close as I can come. I think the connection is there. It perhaps isn't as well defined as that statute tried to make the human right to water. Good question.
Art, do you want to ask a question before my last question? I want to give you the right of question. Okay. What's your best advice to youngish water lawyers out there? And in truth, we all think we're youngish.
I thought that once, but it's been a very long time. I've been thinking about that because when we last met, you mentioned something about that. And I had a couple of thoughts that I jotted down. And I talked before about the 3 A's when you asked me about people I admire. I'm going to talk about the 4 F's now. What I hope youngish and younger water lawyers will understand is, in any situation that's before you, it is absolutely critical that you understand the facts. Go out and walk the ground. Don't hang back. Find the most knowledgeable people, engineers or operators or growers or ditch tenders. Find the facts, understand them comprehensively. Art talked about on the Klamath Valley, and had read those big stacks of technical papers. You gotta do that. Understand the fundamentals. Understand the fundamentals of the water rights or claims to water rights that your client has, and that every other claimant or competitor to that system has. And as Pat Mulroy said, you've got to be in a position to make the argument every one of them would make, as well as they can make it, in order to fully grasp the situation that you're coping with. And I made the point before about friends. If you're in a situation where you're in negotiation or in a board proceeding or in litigation, don't expect everybody who's there is going to be your friend. But you can't ever lie. You can't lie to them, and you can't lie to yourself. You need to spend a long time developing relationships with those people and And frankly, in many of the situations we deal with, this is not so much the litigation situation, but the negotiation situation, you gotta show up in their boardrooms, you gotta show up in their barns or in their pump houses, you might show up in their living rooms. You've gotta understand them, and they've gotta understand you well, for you to be able to advocate for your client. You always